Hello, and welcome to The Alt Left.
Welcome everyone back to listening to The Alt Left. Today we've got a special episode for you. This is not our usual format. This is going to be launched as just an extra piece of content. I was actually interviewed by a sister podcast that also covers political topics much in the same way we do, with three different voices from different areas of the spectrum. I was brought on as a piece they are doing to discuss the evolution of political personal beliefs, and they wanted my perspective from the far left.
So those were our good friends over at Policy War. As Chris was saying, they do a similar format to what we do, only they give you the left, the center, and the right side of things. You can find them at policy_war at Twitter. We'll also be linking to them in this episode, so you can click the link and listen to it on either their website or ours. Give them a like, give them a subscribe, and tell them what you think.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to a special episode of Policy War. Instead of a discussion segment, we have an interview today with Chris from the Alt Left podcast. Chris will introduce himself a little bit about his political beliefs and also how he came to host his podcast. And then I'll ask him a little bit about some of the issues in America today. So, Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your podcast and why you were interested in being involved with it.
So it's in the infant stages. We're actually going to be recording our 7th episode tonight, so we're still pretty new to the game. Basically, we're three cisgender hetero white guys, and we figured that no one ever gets to hear our opinions on things, so we better change that, right?
Yeah, I never.
We're three. Basically, the three of us are friends. We know each other in meat space. And we would basically stay up till 2 a.m. having political conversations constantly until Matt, basically had the idea. He said, we have friends who literally gather around us and listen to us debate and talk. We should turn this into a podcast. And I was actually skeptical at first, and it ended up working really well with you. We decided we did have something here. And so we decided to create a structure and try it out, and we recorded the first one and we were hooked, and now we're just in love with doing it. We follow almost a similar format to you guys. We're like a narrower focus. So where you guys do a left, right, center, we do 3 different degrees of the left. Mm-hmm. And it's a similar kind of, we bring 3 separate perspectives. We just all happen to be more of a closer to an echo chamber. And we discuss just the day's politics, what's going on. We discuss government, finance, political views, economics, and especially we mostly go after, we basically attack the lies and disbeliefs of the right wing. And we also attack the hypocrisy of the Democratic Party and the liberal wing as well.
Yeah, it's good that you do attack the Democratic Party, even though your ideology may be left of center, because people tend to think that we're in kind of a tribe mentality with parties. Democrats bad, Republicans good, vice versa. But I think we have a similar goal of trying to increase dialogue around political issues rather than just be more partisan. But you do have kind of a narrower focus. Can you tell us a little bit about political ideologies you put each of the members in, including yourself? And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one thing we agree on, the 3 of us, and also with your podcast, is we're just like you guys. We're very anti-identity politics. Mm-hmm. We are not into party politics one bit. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. I care about policy. That matters more than anything. Right now, Mitt Romney has more spine and character than half the Democratic Party does. So party doesn't matter to me. I care about praxis and policy. Now, in terms of us, who we are, there's 3 of us. Myself, I'm the host, and then Kay and Matt are the 2 guys who are with me. Kay is probably the furthest right we have. He's kind of your classic Democratic Party liberal. He's very much in line with Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Nancy Pelosi, that kind of ilk. He's a mainstream liberal. Matt is a little more progressive. He's more of a Bernie, AOC, Ilhan Omar kind of guy, who I love them too. And then I'm a little further to that left. I'm beyond progressive. I'm a card carrying communist. So.
All right.
So we cover the left spectrum.
Yeah. We're fine. So I have a Democratic Socialist friend. And I mean, for those that don't know, the difference between social democrat and democratic socialist, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here. Basically, I would consider myself a social democrat. I do not want the abolition of capitalism. I still want capitalism to stay, but just with regulations and a mixed economy, of course. Obviously, welfare programs, universal health care, those things I want, but I still want capitalism to stay. I have a Democratic Socialist friend, and how he describes his belief to me is that he wants workers to get a share of the company. So basically, when you work at a company, you get a share of that company rather than just getting paid by them. It makes it more egalitarian, but also some Democratic Socialists want the complete abolition of capitalism in a way. So
well, I've got some bad news for your friend. He is not a democratic socialist. He's a socialist. You know, what you're talking about, where I want to keep capitalism going, but I want worker protections. I want strong unions. I want the government to provide things like health care and that kind of thing. And you still want a capitalist-free economy, but you want social safety nets and you want worker protections, correct?
Yeah, I want capitalism still. He wanted
that's
like
democratic socialism.
Yeah.
You know, that's democratic socialism. Like that's what, like Bernie Sanders is a perfect example of that. He absolutely wants, like, for instance, he wants private drug companies to remain private drug companies. He doesn't want the abolishment of Pfizer.
Yeah.
He wants them to have their prices regulated, though, so that Americans with diabetes don't have to die because they're poor. You know, that's democratic socialism. Workers owning a piece of the company, that's purely socialism. I mean, that's literally what Marx and Engels talked about which is the proletarian seizing the means of production. That those means of production, that's the company. And for workers to own a stake in that, or at least receive a portion of the profits they create, is actually kind of one of the founding tenements of socialism itself.
So with Marx, he, from what I understand a little of his readings, he of course thought it was going to occur in Germany, not really Russia. And also he thought you would need a violent revolution to secure these proletarian rights. I'm curious as to how, with you being a communist, I do want to ask you how Marxism is different from Stalinism and Leninism, because I feel like being a communist, like, it can mean so many different things. Why don't people just call themselves Marxists if they believe?
It's kind of like saying, like, you're a Christian, right? Like, well, okay, are you a Lutheran? Are you a Presbyterian? Are you an Episcopalian? Are you a Catholic? You know, there's all these different branches, and it is the same thing with something like communism, socialism. Like, for instance, like Stalinism. You know, people, a lot of us Penkos get a lot of we get called tankies, and we get brought under, oh, well, you like Stalin and you like Kim Jong-il. And it's like, no, not at all. But Stalin wasn't a communist. Stalin was an authoritarian dictator. He had a lot more in common with Trump than he did with Lenin. Yeah. You know, so no, I mean, let me just go ahead and say that most people on my end of the spectrum completely disavow Stalin's, and I'll go on the record, Stalin was a monster. Yeah. He absolutely, I mean, he created a massive famine in the Ukraine. I mean, it was all for his own, mostly for his own ego. He refused to heed good advice on actual policy. Like, no, Stalin was terrible. Mm-hmm. And he only rose to power by being a son of a bitch. I mean, he wasn't even supposed to be the successor to Lenin. When Lenin died, he literally wrote this massive letter about, like, hey, by the way, guys, don't trust Stalin. That guy sucks. And Stalin got a hold of that. And unfortunately, Lenin was also dying of a stroke and also talked a lot of shit about some other very powerful people. And so they all kind of got together and went like, you know, we all have this vested interest in not letting this see the light of day. So they got rid of it. And then Trotsky who was a military genius and was far more in favor of workers. And again, he wasn't perfect either. Trotsky did some shit I'm not a fan of. But for the most part, Trotsky had the right idea. And so Stalin actually had him receive the news of Lenin's death late. Trotsky wasn't there for the funeral. Like, Stalin came out to be this big hero. He was a nobody. Nobody really cared about him or knew who he was outside of the inner circle. And he got this fame from that. And then he would constantly spend the next year basically trashing Trotsky, getting his allies to pick fights with him until basically no one wanted Trotsky around. And he pulled this, it was very Game of Thrones political maneuvering. So he's kind of this example of this guy who never should have been in that position in the first place because he was a sociopath. And he made a couple of the right moves and was in the right place at the right time. And a lot of people died because of it. Stalinism is pure authoritarianism. You know, Trump and Stalin actually have a lot in common. They don't care about policy. They don't care about having people in the right places. They care about their own ego and they care about their own iron grip.
We're getting back to America. And yes, I mean, Trotsky was basically assassinated by Stalin. And he has corrupted the view of communism to people. When people think of communism, they think of Russia rather than how Marx thought of communism. Since you're a communist, I want to hear how you became one born in one of the most capitalist countries in the world, United States of America?
I would actually have to say it's probably because I live in one of the most capitalist countries in the world. I would like to think that if I grew up in like Western Europe or something, and if I grew up in Great Britain or in Germany or France or Spain or the Netherlands, I would actually probably be far more moderate than I am. My hardcore leftism tends to come as a reaction to what I see as the American government has kind of become, in my opinion, a bit of an evil empire. We spend more money on our military than the next 10 nations combined, and almost all of those are our allies. You know, we're literally trying to outspend our allies. We have military bases all around the world. No one has a military base in the United States. You don't see a French military base in Iowa.
That's just true.
Yeah, I mean, look what's gone on in the Middle East since World War II. It's been an absolute resource grab. World War II, the UK and France were destroyed. Their empires fell apart. And we literally you may have heard of Operation Paperclip. And that was, for any of your listeners who don't know, Operation Paperclip was this clandestine operation. Is right when World War II ended, the USSR and the US were in this race to grab as many Nazi rocket scientists as they could. And Operation Paperclip was that was the US's operation to grab them. We gave them money, gave them citizenship, gave them amnesty from war crimes trials, and Russia did the same thing, which is what led to the space race. Both of these empires had these massive industries, and now we had all these Nazi scientists who were going to help us build rockets to fight each other and go into space. And it was the same. It's the same kind of thing. The UK and all the European empires fell apart, and the US and the USSR got in this race of ideology to control puppet states. We basically declared dibs on the ocean and picked up where the UK left off. And I mean, Vietnam was us taking over for France. As their empires crumbled piece by piece in Africa, in South America, in the Middle East, and in East Asia, we picked up the slack so they wouldn't, quote unquote, fall to communism. And Russia did the same thing. Russia was trying to spread their ideology as fast and hard as they could. But then they fell apart and we became the only superpower. And now we've basically spent the last 30, 40 years terrorizing the planet for resources and money. So in response to that, I would say I wasn't, born this way technically, but I mean, you could say that the ideals of socialism, basically what we're taught in kindergarten. Look at the Amish, that's a communist society. But beyond that, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Beyond that, it was probably, I came of age in, I'm a millennial. I came of age during 9/11, and I watched George W. Bush's presidency come, and all of a sudden, I started questioning my patriotism and questioning what it meant to be an American. And what are we doing? We're going to war? And then, I remember when the Iraq War happened. At the time, I was dumbfounded. I was like, you're telling me a Saudi Arabian guy in Afghanistan from a cave launched a bombing attack and we're going to invade Iraq? How does that make sense in any way, shape? It's to get to Iran. That's where we've been at this whole time. We've been after Iran for decades. John Bolton was saying that during the Trump, when John Bolton was part of the Trump cabinet, he was, saying how we're going to celebrate in Tehran by the end of this presidency. It's been this dream of the right wing to conquer Iran. And that's just one of many. There's been CIA coups that's why people say, like, well, communism works on paper, but never in reality. It's kind of hard to find a communist nation that didn't have a CIA-backed coup against their leadership. Look at Thomas Sankara in Africa. That guy was amazing. You want to talk about a humanitarian who did nothing but took over the country for the betterment of his people, eradicated illiteracy, eradicated famines, foregoed his salary and put it directly back into the populace, and he was killed by us and the French.
So I see your main problem here is the U.S. basically becoming imperialist of the New World, after World War II. And the Truman Doctrine of containment, which is basically used to make the Soviets the enemy and the reason for U.S. expansionism. And that expanding beyond Ronald Reagan's time after the Soviet Union fell, and it's still here. The American empire is the biggest in the world, of course. We have over 800 military bases. We have defense treaties with the Philippines and Japan and Taiwan saying, if anybody attacks you, we'll defend you. But also we created NATO. We founded the United Nations. Pretty much all the economic and worldly global institutions that have prominence were started by the U.S. to increase their power. But also, I can see you're saying it went too far, basically. And this this fight against communism had led to a fight against democracy in some countries, but also wasting money in the military. Is that one of your biggest gripes?
Yeah, I would say it's half and half. So half of it's definitely geopolitical. Because I mean, look at Vietnam, for instance, right? So the Vietnamese have self-determined decided to switch to a communist government, and immediately these guys have been fighting off the Chinese forever. Then the French come after them, because they want to get independence from the French Empire. And then after the French can't, throw in the towel, we take over because, again, we can't let the Chinese and the Russians win, right? We go after the Vietnamese, and then we finally leave. And now we're saying this is about freedom. We're saying this is about human rights. Yeah. Meanwhile, in Cambodia, Pol Pot, next door to Vietnam, Pol Pot's doing ethnic cleansing. He is the envy of Hitler, what this guy's doing. And he's absolutely creating a genocide of his own people in Cambodia. We do nothing about it, and then we leave and never go back. And the first thing Vietnam does is go over to Cambodia and take him out for being a monster. And so it kind of shows you, well, who's the bad guy here? Mm-hmm. And so, we could talk for 7 hours about history of this, but that geopolitical expansion the United States has done is definitely half of it. And the other half, I would say, is domestic. To be on this, I believe in being on the side of the oppressed. And when I see the people who are anti-Islamophobia, who are anti-racism, anti-sexism, people who support the LGBTQ plus community, they tend to be the socialists, and they tend to be the liberals, and never the right wing. And that's the problem, is the conservative side of the spectrum is on the wrong side of history every time. And so regardless of what you emotionally feel, it's hard to look at it categorically. And you have one side that is flawed sometimes and good sometimes, and then you have one side that is on the wrong side of the ball on every issue. So and it's hard to support them.
So with the social issues, you're on the left, but communism is just by nature an egalitarian philosophy. And, people on the left probably value egalitarianism more than people on the right, who mostly value, I would say, individual responsibility and the status quo, in all honesty. So with that diversion of social, obviously, why the radical in American terms, shift towards communism? And well, how would you define communism? Because I could define it wrong here. Because define your.
So again, and to yes, I absolutely like Asita Shakur, I say that being communist is the greatest compliment I can give myself, but it's not that it's an economic policy I think could be put in place tomorrow. In terms of what I think needs to be established right now, I'm a socialist, because communism has never truly existed. People say, communist China. Because communism is the abolishment of the state. Yeah. So, if we're going to go with communist political theory, first you have to have generations and centuries of socialism until finally the society has evolved to a place where needs are met and personal wealth and power are no longer sought after. And then once that's done, you can abolish the state. But again, I will be the first to admit it's a pipe dream. It's a goal. We're not there. We're not going to be there for a long time, but it's a goal. Just kind of like one day we'd like to colonize other planets. We're not going to get there anytime soon, but it's something we should build towards. So communism is an ideal. And the path to get there for me is socialism. And we're the only developed nation that won't adopt these policies. We're the only developed nation that tells old people, like, well, if you can't live on your retirement, then die. Well, you can't afford medications, that sucks, die. You have pre-existing conditions. Up until we had the Affordable Care Act, we would tell people who had 7-year-olds with leukemia, like, sorry, your kid hit their limit and they have a pre-existing condition, so it's just time for them to die now. No, they talk about, Obamacare leads to death panels. We have death panels. It's the private healthcare industry. And that was the protection, where it screams, oh, it's socialism and it's evil and it's wrong. And it's like, the government should exist for one reason, and that's to protect the general welfare of the citizens. And if our government's not going to protect our interests, what good is it?
And the thing is, when you have this international understanding of how other countries' governments work, universal healthcare, policies like that aren't as radical. Once you understand that, it's actually very common in other countries. Like, it was first established in Norway in the early 1900s. And European countries, they just see what their neighbors do, and in large part, they copy them in a large way because they see that it works and it's effective. While America, our neighbors are Canada, who's way more progressive than we are, of course, and then Mexico, which is,
Mexico's more progressive than we are. They have socialized medicine.
Yeah, I mean, they also have, also a drug cartel. So, you know, we don't give them that
But what's
much
the root of
credit.
that one? The drug cartels pretty much run the business at the northern border.
Yeah,
Like,
I
drug
mean,
cartels are a problem when they're near America.
if you're a union leader in Mexico, there's a high chance you'll get assassinated rather than last a year in that position. You know,
Fair point.
it's hard for Americans to look at our neighbors and like give them recognition. I feel like it's like we act like we're supremacists because of our military policy. Of course, when people say America's the best country in the world, it's definitely not because of equality. It's definitely not because of human rights. It's definitely not because of our democratic ability, of course, of recent events. So
Yeah, no, America's the number one country in terms of xenophobia and prison populations. That's about it.
yeah, and then homicides of a developed country, that too. And it's sad when people say we're the best nation. So what nation should we look at for policies in the future? Should we
Most,
just look at Europe, or is there any country you really like in particular?
I think we should look at every single country in the world and find out what might work. And if it's a better policy we have, we should adopt it. Like, I just think there is no one nation we should model.
Mhm.
I think there's a plethora. You know, I mean, look at the French. There's a lot of things I don't like about the French. They still have a lot of their imperial crap going on with Africa. However, that's a nation that's in a constant state of revolution. I don't know a Western European nation that takes better care of its workers and has a better idea of workers' rights than France. The UK, they did a really smart thing. They realized the House of Lords, the higher level of parliament, was stupid, and they completely neutered it, which is what we should do. The Senate shouldn't exist. You know, the idea that 12 people in Fort Buffalo, Nebraska, have 10 times the voting power of someone in California, Texas, or New York, where there's actual population density, is insane. You can't call that democracy. That's a republic gone wrong. And so we need to look at our neighbors in the world. I mean, again, look Vietnam, not perfect, major corruption issues, but when it came to establishing a basic code of ethics of not being assholes around the world, that's something we should look at what they did. We should look at what's gone on in some of the areas of Africa. Again, Thomas Sankara, hero of mine, amazing dude. We should start looking at these policies where, isn't it amazing how these populist leaders rise from nothing when their only message is, I'm not going to let your children starve in the street? You know, and that's some bare minimum shit. And we have in America the exact opposite. Right now, it's amazing. It's a political issue whether or not Black people are human beings in this country. What? Like, how am I living it? But it's like, no, we've only, look at Hillary Clinton, for instance, right? So Hillary Clinton, when she ran for president 4 years ago, came out and finally shifted her right to say, I am now for gay marriage. Now, is that because Hillary Clinton really changed her mind? I actually don't think Hillary Clinton was ever anti-gay, but it was unpopular to be pro-gay marriage. And so she just shifted with the winds. But that's American politics, is I'll go ahead and declare a category of citizens as less than human because it suits me. And that's as American as apple pie. Look, you don't have to go far back. A little over 100 years ago, we had Jim Crow rising in the South, where we had far more corrupt elections than we've ever had in our lives. You know, we had a bunch of assholes storm the Capitol and do a little bit of property damage and scare some people. But when during Reconstruction, we literally had the police bombing polling places and carrying out lynchings, which was far worse than what happened today. So when people look at this and say, this isn't who we are, this is exactly who we are.
I mean, it's funny that, you know, you talk about racism that has stagnated in America, along with the Capitol protest / riot from a bunch of Trump supporters. Because, I mean, just 60 years ago, you know, we had the March on Washington led by MLK, which was a peaceful protest. When historians write about this event that just happened this week, and they look at the March on Washington, they'll see which one has the moral high ground. Like, one's arguing for human rights, equal rights, and voting rights, while basically Trump supporters are arguing for the ignoring of the democratic establishment of America and overturning the election. It's just so amazing.
Yeah, those are the two biggest political protest issues we have right now. Are Black people human beings? Mm-hmm. And should we let fascists tear down elections? Those are the two issues. And people actually want to somehow compromise on that. And I ask, where's the middle ground? Like, where's the middle ground on either of those? Where do you compromise with someone who says, like, I know the election went one way, but that hurts my feelings, and so I'm going to go ahead and storm the Capitol and tear down the entire democratic process because of what I want, which is an argument about democracy, because democracy is polite violence. It is establishing which majority gets to oppose their will in the minority. But that aside, that is, how do you come to a middle ground with these Trumpsters who want to violently storm the Capitol and carry out a fascist coup? How do you meet them halfway? You can't. And the All Lives Matter pig kissing crowd, how do you meet them halfway? When, what was it? 3 days ago they just announced that the cops who shot what's his name 7 times in the back because he was checking on his kids in his car won't face a single charge.
He didn't get convicted. Are you talking about that?
Not convicted. He won't even be tried. He won't even be fired. He's not even getting a reprimand. I mean, this dude got a hug and a kiss on his way out the door for murdering a man in the street. Breonna Taylor had the audacity to be asleep in her own bed. And what happened? She gets gunned down because the cops who already caught the person they're looking for knocked on the wrong house, and a man who had the Second Amendment right to defend his own home against an unlawful intrusion gets shot, and his fiance dies because she was too busy sleeping after her work of saving people in the hospital. Breonna Taylor gets gunned down. And what happens? These cops get arrested for damaging the property of white neighbors. That's the fallout from that.
With how slow America's developing and progressing as a country, how long do you think it'll be till we actually get a president in the White House that is at least progressive in nature and not just the neoliberal establishment president that we've had over and over and over again? Like I've heard with Joe Biden, he's literally said there will be no fundamental change when I'm in government.
Nothing will fundamentally change.
Yep. I doubt he won't even remember what bill he passed yesterday. It's hard for him to do that.
Talk about a guy who's out of touch. I mean, how do you look at what's happening right now in the streets of America and you're like, my VP should be a cop?
The prosecutor who arrested thousands on marijuana, and then once they get in Senate, they're like, oh yeah, I approve legalized marijuana. I think that's a great idea.
And then didn't want to let people out of prison. Her department kept them there because it would cost too much money. I mean, that's literally slavery.
So, I mean, I could every time I discuss American politics, it's just about how messed up our system is. So, for the question I asked you, how long do you think it'll be till we actually get a progressive in the White House?
I don't know, because Obama is probably one of the most progressive presidents we've had since God. He's more. I mean, Carter is a more progressive human being. Jimmy Carter's an amazing dude, but he wasn't that progressive of a president. Obama's the most progressive guy we've had in a very long time. And he couldn't take on the establishment. I mean, literally, we had a liberal, democratic, black president, and the Klan is still fucking legal. That's what blows my mind. I got to tell you, I'm not a big fan of the DNC, but when Biden first announced his run and he called out Trump for white nationalism, I was like, oh shit, this is actually going to get talked about. We're going to deal with this finally. Because we have the Proud Boys, we have the Klan, we have the Oath Keepers, we have white nationalist domestic terrorists as legal organizations. We talked about it last time on my podcast last week. I said, if you slap on a swastika and walk down the streets in Germany, you go right to jail.
You don't do that in America. Free
but
speech.
Here we drag Confederate flags around, and that's the crux of the problem. We never recovered from the Civil War. And I get a lot of flack for this view, but we didn't burn it down enough. And we allowed it to live, and we allowed Confederate flags to stick around. We allowed Jim Crow to happen. We got halfway through Reconstruction and lost the will to give a shit about people, and that's the problem with capitalism. There wasn't a profit motive for it, and civil rights will always take a back seat. So when you say, when are we going to get this dealt with? I got to tell you, I don't know, because there's a right-wing surge around the world. This isn't even an American problem. The right, conservative, and I'm not talking about like when I say conservative, I don't mean someone who's like, I'm not really into income taxes. I mean like a Trumpster, I'm talking about a modern, actual like racist conservative kind of person, which is most of them, but not all. But that is sweeping the globe. That's why Brexit happened. Brexit didn't happen because of economic policy. Brexit happened because they were like, there's a lot of brown people coming into England. We don't like that anymore. That was really the crux of Brexit. It was an anti-immigration movement. And that's happening everywhere, but it's especially magnified here because we are still a backwards, racist, right-wing nation. 49% of the population voted for this guy. this guy who builds a wall, this guy who murders Mexican children in cages, this guy who goes to rallies and says, look at my African American, the guy who brags about raping women, the most racist, sexist demagogue we've ever had. Andrew Jackson would have a hard-on for Trump. And he was probably one of the worst presidents we've had since ever. Almost half the country thought Trump was a great idea. They looked at 4 years of this asshole and they were like, yep, need more of that. I don't know when, because again, we can't move on until we actually say, hey, the Ku Klux Klan needs to go. We as a society can't even say that we think the Klan needs to be made illegal, because that's not a freedom of speech issue. We already accept in this country limits on freedom of speech. I can't just call up the White House and threaten the president. That's a limit on my speech. I can't walk into a theater and scream fire, right? I can't go on the news and start slandering another person without facing consequences for that. So we accept that there's limits to freedom of speech. I kind of think lynching should be one of them. And it really terrifies me that half the country doesn't agree with me.
You really clearly established how we still have a lot of things we need to solve. Your show and, my show, I think, are important just to make people more educated about these things. I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and doing this interview. Where can people find your show?
Hey, well, thank you for having me, man. This has actually been great. I love doing this. So thank you for having us. And I agree with you. This conversation that we're having is important. It needs to go on all over America. People can find us pretty much anywhere. We've got a link tree that's linked on our Twitter and our Instagram. But you can find us on YouTube. On Instagram, we're The Alt Left Podcast, no spaces. And if you just look up The Alt Left Podcast, you'll find us on Instagram. There's a link tree there. We're on YouTube. We're on Spotify. We're on Podbean. We're on Stitcher, iHeartRadio. You can find us on Twitter. That's probably one of the best places to talk to us. That's our most active one. And our Twitter handle is The Alt Left Pod. And you can search us by The Alt Left Podcast, but at The Alt Left Pod is where you can find us on Twitter. And there's pretty much any way you want to listen to us, we have a link for it. And our link tree is all over there.
Oh, man. I missed the opportunity to talk about the alt-right. Whatever. I mean, I was right in my face. I saw alt-left.
Well, you know what? We're always available. We can do another one of these. I'd love it.
Right. But yeah, thanks for coming on the show. Listeners, thanks for listening. Again, thanks for listening. Please leave a review on iTunes if you like this episode. And that's us heading out.
All right. Well, that was the interview, folks. We'd like to thank Russell and the other hosts there at Policy War Podcast. We really appreciate you guys collaborating with us. Go check them out. Give them a like, share, or subscribe. And remember, folks, the revolution is you.